I want to thank Foreign Minister Wang Yi for presenting China's perspectives on how to improve the state of the world and also how to improve the geopolitical landscape that we have now. This is going to be an interesting session. The title is Geopolitical Rivalries, the West and Global South in the 21st Century World Order. And as we look at the evolving geopolitical landscape, we see at least two trends that are worth noting. One is the fact that the Western world is becoming more coherent, and certainly this has been stimulated or catalyzed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now there's much more coherent diplomatic and strategic and economic policies among the Western world. There are policies at decoupling and de-risking towards Russia or China. There's greater arms spending in many Western countries and certainly in Europe. And meanwhile, what we see in the global South is more activity and more confidence and more dynamism. We see quite a few middle powers in the global South that are taking a more active role in international affairs. The G20 chairmanship have been held or will be held by three countries of developing South, Indonesia recently, now India, and then South Africa. We see a lot of trends of mini-lateralism within the global South. We saw the World Cup being held in Qatar gloriously. Emirates is going to be hosting a COP28 climate conference. But certainly the visibility and role and relevance and dynamism of global South is something that is adding substance to international relations. And to discuss the relationship between the West and the global South, we have a panel of four. We have Dr. Samir Saran, President of Observer Research Foundation of India. We have Natalie Samara Singh, a Global Director for Advocacy at the Open Society Foundation. She's based in the United Kingdom. We have Dr. Natalie Tocci, Director of Istituto Affari Internazionali from Italy. I hope that accent impressed you, Dr. Natalie. And Professor Tim Muriti, Head of Peace Building Intervention Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation of South Africa. I will begin with Dr. Samir Saram from ORF India. Dr. Samir, there's much talk about the global South these days. Is the global South really rising? And if so, where is it heading? And can you also shed some light on how would you describe the relationship between the West and the global South today, reflecting on India's own experience? Please.
Thank you, Dino, and congratulations for this next new edition of this town hall. I think you are really offering all of us a great platform to have discussions on issues that matter most to many around the world. So on your question, is the global South rising? Well, the facts say that they are. The IMF data says that the global South is rising. It suggests that close to 80% of global growth is going to be contributed by developing and emerging economies this year and the year hereafter, and probably that will be the trend over the decade. So in terms of the sheer contribution to global growth and global well-being, the global South is rising. In another sense, it is also rising because it is describing its needs, it is describing its aspirations, and it is describing what it seeks in its own terms. We are now no longer hostage to descriptions by Western scholars and Western institutions, and we are using the advantages of communication and the amplification of media that exists courtesy digitalization, which is, by the way, greatly embraced by the global South. We are using this opportunity to describe ourselves in our own terms. The global South certainly knows what it is not, and it is certainly not what has been the definition typically in many Western observations. It is also describing what it seeks to be. It seeks to be green. It seeks to be digitally savvy. It seeks to meet the needs and development aspirations of its people. And certainly, it seeks to create frameworks which allow it greater agency and greater voice in matters of international relations. Is it a perfect grouping? Absolutely not. It is a mixed grouping with countries having different regimes, different political systems, different economic realities, and certainly differential economic needs as well. What are the relationships between the West? Let me add a new term here. I like your question. What are India's own experiences in its relationship between the West? Let me also use East, because although the foreign minister of China cleverly injected himself into the global South, they are not. China is not part of the global South. It is a distinct entity, and it needs to be separated from all of us. And I think the question would be better served if what are India's relationships with the West and the East as it looks sitting in its vantage point of the South. And I would suggest that increasingly, due to actions of China, there are limited possibilities to look eastwards in a comprehensive manner. While we have partnerships in Japan and South Korea and many other and ASEAN, we find it extremely difficult to have significant and substantial relationships with China, who is not only acting as an exclusive actor, something it has accused the West of, but it also shows complete lack of reciprocity, which is the Chinese model of decoupling. Let's not forget the fireball of China. Let's not forget Chinese nationalistic trade policies that benefited them and excluded others from that particular treatment. But also on the West, I think we have a relationship which is textured, a layered relationship. We are finding that when it comes to key matters of responding to the climate challenge, of technology and digitalization, of security and international governance, India finds itself far more comfortable in discussing these issues and common futures with interlocutors from the West. Of course, there are frictions and issues from history that continue to linger. There are sometimes suspicions on intrusion and interference that emerge out of those geographies. But I would suggest that we are far more comfortable today with the West, if I was to define it in a singular term, than we were before. We would have frictions with certain countries and certain institutions and organizations there. But more broadly, I think the arc seems to be bringing us closer rather than taking us apart. Now, with the South itself, I think we are beginning to realize that we don't want to choose between the binaries of East offered by China and the West offered by the old powers. We think a third path is possibly something that suits many of us in these part in the differentiated and heterogeneous grouping that's called the global South. And you will see different countries aligned to different pathways in the days ahead. We are all going to rise together, perhaps at different speeds, but we are not heading in the same direction. And I think the biggest global governance question for the future is how many of them head eastwards, the China model, and how many seek a more open and free economic and political system and build their own versions of liberalism and democratic credentials. And certainly, liberalism and democracy is not a virtue of the West. Please understand, some of the oldest experiences happen to come from the East. So are we going to be promoting our own models of liberal and democratic credentials and growth in the future? And that could be one model that emerges from some countries in the South. And while the others may feel tempted to have a more authoritarian and controlled regime system that proliferates in certain parts of the world. So the South is rising. Clearly, the numbers tell us that. And it's headed, but in different directions. So it's possibly maybe a little dangerous to view the South as a singular and a similar entity. It is a complex, it's a complex landscape. I hope that answers your question, Dean.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Samir. Let me now turn to Natalie Samarasinghe, Global Director for Advocacy at the Open Society Foundations. Natalie, thank you for joining us. And as we know, since the Russia-Ukraine war, Western countries have shown greater interest in the global South. On the other hand, the responses from many countries in the global South have been mixed. And in fact, this episode has shown that there has been a persistent anti-Western attitudes in many countries in the South, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth. Can you tell us why do these Western attitudes persist in some of these countries, and what would be the best path forward in terms of relationship between the West and the global South? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dina, and it's a real honor to join this distinguished panel of speakers and people around the world. I want to start with a couple of short disclaimers which build on Dr. Samir Sarman's point that neither the global South nor indeed the West, are coherent blocks. And I do think there's a danger, especially for the smaller countries, in seeing them as such. There's a different layer to the geopolitical rivalries of the smaller states who need a voice. The second disclaimer, because this is a global town hall, is just to say that people are not their governments. So, we are talking about geopolitical rivalries, but when you go to people, as Open Society recently did, we went and polled about 30 countries representing 5.5 billion people. And we found overwhelmingly people share the same hopes and fears. They support democracy and human rights. They're concerned about climate change. They agree there needs to be more action on development, on debt relief, on climate finance. So I just feel like while we're having this discussion, we shouldn't forget that governments say one thing, but global citizens are pretty much united on what they want their leaders to do. But of course, the geopolitical context is extremely, extremely challenging. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think, really shook many, many people in the West and brought them out of their comfort zone. It brought home the reality of war on their doorstep, and it raised questions about the political and economic order that has prevailed since the end of the Second World War. Now, many in the developing world are, of course, concerned about the war. There is solidarity with Ukraine. There is an understanding this is a country being attacked by a bigger neighbor. There's fear about the threat posed by, Russia. If it becomes a fading nuclear state, I think there's an understanding of those dangers. There's, of course, worry about the knock-on effects the conflict is having on food prices, inflation, and so on. But I think what really happened, especially in the immediate aftermath, is there was a failure by not all, but many Western diplomats to understand that people across the global South have long been expected to tolerate war and insecurity, and that their experience of the global system is one that isn't fair, that one that expects them to be rule takers, to pay up to 8 times as much to borrow money, to pursue austerity instead of stimulus when in economic crises, to host the majority of the world's refugees, to bear the brunt of the climate emergency. So I think it has been quite a process to get slowly more recognition in the West that now is the time to make good on the string of broken promises we've seen over the past few years, whether that is access to COVID vaccines, more finance to boost liquidity in tough times, climate finance, loss and damage. We've seen all these promises that haven't been delivered on. That really, to me, is the path forward. I think the West needs to do more than just say warm words on solidarity. But I think even, these measures are still too transactional because they are crucial. But what we really need to see now is a willingness by Western countries to change the global system so that developing countries have a real say and real leverage, in these global spaces. And I think that is a thread that could and should emerge strongly from the next G20 meetings, not just, the one imminently upon us in India, but also in Brazil. Because even if, as, Dr. Saran was saying, countries are developing different paths, I think a unified push around that kind of an agenda could be really powerful right now.
Okay, thank you, Natalie, and thank you for cutting your comment short. Now I turn to Dr. Natalie Tocci, Director for Istituto Affari Internazionali from Italy. Hi, Natalie. How are you? I wanna ask you to expand more on what Dr. Natalie Samara Singh said just now. This is about the relationship between the West and the global South. I remember taking part in Munich Security Conference, and the theme of the West needing to embrace and engage the global South was very strong. And in fact, the Japanese G7 presidency intentionally invited leaders from the global South to to be part of the summit. So, can you explain to us what is driving this? What is the strategic objective, and whether or not this attempt by the Western government to embrace the global South, is it a one-off event, or is this something that is rather for a medium or longer term?
Well, thank you very much, Dino. It's a real pleasure. This is actually my first global town hall. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. So very briefly, sort of 5 minutes on, why is this happening and what is actually, how are we going about it? So I would say, sort of why is it the West is waking up to the global South? Many of the reasons actually have already been mentioned by Samir and Natalie. Let me just kind of, boil it down to 3 points. First point, because the global South is making its voice heard. And whether it's making that voice heard in political terms, by building institutions, through its economic dynamism, through an increasing dynamism of civil society, of which this particular meeting is obviously one prime example, essentially it is making its voice heard. And given that, rights are generally not granted, they are generally taken, the global South is taking rights upon itself, rightly so. So I would say that's, in a sense, reason number one. Reason number two is that, and this is obviously connected to this, the global South increasingly matters. It increasingly matters economically. It increasingly matters in many of the key themes of the 21st century, like the energy transition, like the theme of critical minerals. And so, in a sense, the West cannot do without, right, the global South. It is simply something that, many of the themes that that we will need to be working on, whether this is climate, whether this is artificial intelligence, whether this is, how to handle pandemics, it is simply something that we, the West, in a sense, cannot do alone, right? So global South matters, global South is making its voice heard, and so, in a sense, there's a certain inevitability to greater engagement in and with the global South. I think there's also a quote-unquote more contingent reason, which is indeed connected to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And let me be very frank about this. In a sense, this came as a bit of a shock to the West. It was kind of obvious to many in the West that, given such a blatant violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that everyone in the world would kind of, sort of have the same view and perspective on the war. The fact that this was not the case, and the fact that behind the fact that this was not the case, there was many of the reasons that Natalie was mentioning earlier, in a sense, has not necessarily deepened divisions between the global North and South. It has simply exposed many of those resentments and disappointments, which in a sense, I almost view it as a positive thing. Sort of all of these resentments have now surfaced. We can now have a more honest conversation about our relationship, which then leads me to perhaps 3 very brief points about what is it that can be done about it. I mean, the simple answer is greater engagement, but I think behind that simple answer, there are all sorts of challenges that need to be addressed. Let me perhaps mention 3 of them as far as particularly a European perspective on this is concerned. First challenge is, how do we, in a sense, balance and rebalance pragmatism and principle? We know that we cannot go about principle in the quote-unquote old way. What do I mean by the old way? For instance, old policies of political conditionality. That was, in a sense, a method, whether it was right or wrong, but it was a method in a sense that really spoke to a world where there was a certain Western monopoly over influence. In a world in which there is competition, that is no longer an available method. And yet you don't want to throw the baby out with the water. How do you go about reimagining principle in a world in which there is multi-alignment, there is multi-polarity? So that's one challenge. A second set of challenges is, how do you deliver impact behind, for instance, your assistance, behind your engagement, in a world in which there will always be rules and there will always be bureaucracy, and that, as we know, often hinders the visibility and the impact of Western engagement. So, a lot of money, for instance, put in the European Global Gateway. How many people sort of in this meeting have actually seen concrete results coming from that? And yet there is a lot of money on the table. A third set of challenges really revolves, I think, around how do you reimagine economic partnerships in a world which in many respects is a post-free trade agreement world, in a world in which economic partnerships really have to revolve around, how do you ensure the co-industrial development of partners in the global north and the global south. In a sense, we no longer have a ready-made formula, for this. And I think this is as much a challenge for the global north as and for the global south. So let me stop there, Dino.
Thank you, Natalie. I think that sets up the stage for Dr. Tim Muriti of South Africa. And South Africa has just concluded a BRICS summit, which was very interesting because they announced the expansion of BRICS to new members. And what I want to ask you is, Dr. Tim, what would be the geopolitical and geoeconomic impact of this recent BRICS expansion? And how would the world order be modified or changed by the BRICS Plus? Earlier today, Professor Kishore Mahbubani said that what is different about BRICS today and 10 years ago was that 10 years ago, BRICS were like half of the economy of G7. But now BRICS is larger in terms of economic size than the G7. So clearly that translates into a greater role and impact. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dino, for this invitation and also for this excellent initiative. It's really an honor to be on this very distinguished panel. Just to say, at the recent successful 15th BRICS summit held in Johannesburg, South Africa, has established, I would argue, the foundations for the emergence of a multipolar world order. And African countries have been arguing and agitating for the transformation of the multilateral system to reflect the realities of the 21st century for quite a long time. And the fact that 42 countries officially expressed an interest in joining the BRICS grouping, and the recent inclusion of the 6 countries, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, which includes major members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is an indication that the formation, I think, is now open to future expansion, but also it's going to be a significant, I would say, geo-economic powerhouse on the global stage. By 2024, the new BRICS formation, as you mentioned, Dr. Dina, will have a GDP greater than that of the G7 countries, dominated by Western countries. It'll be home to almost half of the world's population and possess 43% of the share of oil production. And so in this sense, the BRICS formation will be a geopolitical as well as a geoeconomic powerhouse through also notably its new development bank, which will be providing lines of credit to its members, including other members from the global south. I would argue that the progressive emergence of BRICS, if we put it in context, is the direct consequence of the intransigence and the inertia of the West in terms of reforming the multilateral system, which can be traced back to the 1990s, early 1990s, when there was an inflection point, the original global inflection point that should have been taken advantage of. But the West decided to maintain the status quo because it was beneficial to its societies. And in this intervening 30-year period, since the end of the Cold War, we're witnessing the emergence of a spate of ad hoc formations, G20, BRICS, so on and so forth, which I would argue is a sign of the global system needing to change. And the attitude can be linked, this attitude that prevented the shift can be linked to what I would call very colonial, paternalistic, hegemonic attitudes. If you recall Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, describing Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as the jungle, and the importance of the garden is protecting the garden from the jungle. So the fact that the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization were reformed to move away from the harsh conditionalities and the heavy interest rates that they were imposing on global South countries, subject them to a debt trap, means that the global economic system really needed to shift. So I would say that BRICS is also reaching out to the global South, and in Africa, we're looking at opportunities for increased industrialization, diversification of the economies, the continent's economies, and leveraging the African continental free trade area. So in my sense, I think the BRICS will continue to grow and will function as an embryonic building block to gradually create a multipolar world order. And I think the West should seek to engage BRICS through dialogue, rather than through disruption and efforts to sabotage the blocs. There's been a lot of rhetoric about the transformation, for example, of the United Nations Security Council, which President Biden himself indicated in the General Assembly of last year, and there's actually been no clear movement in this direction. So the multilateral system really has to transform towards being more fair and legitimate. From the African perspective, we have been arguing for the need to utilize the United Nations Charter mechanism, which is Article 109 within the UN Charter, to actually convene a United Nations Charter Review Conference, which can then enable all the members of the world to participate in a much more expansive dialogue in terms of what sort of international multilateral systems would we like to see in the 21st century going forward. I think that would be my take on this, and I believe that we live in interesting times, but we have to manage the tensions so that they don't, in fact, lead to a greater conflagration. Indeed, the Ukraine crisis is a turning point. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a turning point for the world, and we must take advantage to use this moment to introspect and, in fact, come up with new ideas in terms of how we can reshape and remold the world going forward. Thank you, Dr. Dino.
Thank you, Professor Tim. Now, let me get response from the discussants. I would like to invite Professor Amitav Acharya. I think those of you who study international relations, you'll be very familiar with his work. He's a very prolific writer, and he's now teaching at the American University. And he's quite an interesting character because he's Indian, he lives in the United States, and now he's in my hometown attending in Jakarta, attending an ASEAN event. Professor Amitav, please.
Thank you very much, and greetings, everybody. There's been a lot of great ideas on the table from our four speakers, and I don't have time to comment on all of them, but I'd like to highlight, starting with Shamir Saran's idea of the third way of building world order is something that I have been also speaking about, written about, that the world doesn't have to choose between United States and China, and it's not choosing. To give you two very good examples, and right here in Indonesia is a classic example. It's not like China, it's a democracy, and it's not like the United States because it's a post-colonial country that really aspires and empathizes with post-colonial aspirations. India is another country. It's a democracy, so very different from China, but it's not rejecting, unlike some countries that may want to aspire the Chinese model. India doesn't really have any aspiration to be like China or follow the Chinese model. But India also is a post-colonial nation, and in many ways, as Samir said, it's more genuinely so than China because it was actually fully colonized by the British. So maybe we should look into countries like Indonesia and India rather than talk about the U.S.-China rivalry as the kind of starting point of our conversation about world order. And the third way of building world order is a very good way to go about it. The other point is about the global South. We all heard from all the speakers is diverse, but I see that there is an increasing, the real division in the global South or in the world order today is not between the West and the rest, but within the global South. So what I used to call and now still call the poor South and the power South. There are some countries of the South which are really like the BRICS, the aspiring BRICS. They are, of course, they're much bigger powers, more consequential than many, many countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia who do not have the voice. So how do you create a level playing field within the South and not just always talk about the South-North or West-South divisions? That's another thing to talk about. Third point, quick point, is a response to Natalie, my old friend. I think you're quite right that people in Europe were shocked, but people like me were not surprised at all by the way the global South responded to the Ukraine crisis. Because you said it was partly because of resentments of the past. You can add double standards of how the United States has done in its invasion of Iraq, and also it's also about the legacy of colonialism. It was not at all surprising that the way the global South responded to the Ukraine. However, most countries of global South do not endorse Russian invasion of Ukraine. They do not support it. They do not like it, and many of them are on record condemning it. But condemning the Russian aggression on Ukraine is not the same as embracing the Western liberal order. You can do both. You can condemn the Russian aggression. You can also condemn the American or the Western hypocrisy and also the problems of the West liberal order, or what they call rules-based order. And I'll start by giving you a very interesting report. Many of you might have known how the Western the U.S.-dominated liberal order has been inclusive or not. A couple of months ago, the UN Secretary General released the issue brief where he made the point that during the COVID, IMF gave $280 billion in special drawing rights to G7 countries, but $8 billion to the least developing countries. So $280 billion to G7, $8 billion to LDC. And Mr. Guterres said, this was done according to the rules. I quote him. So rules-based order. So this is consistent with IMF rules. But there is something morally wrong in this case. So this is why a lot of the global South countries reject the contemporary world order, and they want to see changes. And this is also why we should look for some new vocabulary and think about how to reform the global institutions in a very meaningful way. If the UN Secretary General thinks there's something wrong, something morally wrong about the way the institutions go about, international institutions that are created and developed by the West who are doing their business, then there is really time to change. Very finally,
I think I need to stop you there, Professor Amitav.
The point that governments are not people, and that's why talking about multipolarity is marginalizing people. Because multipolarity is about power, great powers. It's not about people. And if you want to build a people's world, you should talk about something else, not great powers only.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Amitav. I would like to invite now Professor Phoebe Konduri, founder and scientific chair of Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation on Aphoria from Greece. Yeah. Professor Phoebe, please.
Thank you very much for having me. It has been really a very interesting conversation. Let me, in my 3 minutes, focus on one issue that I think is crucial. We are facing a global economy with multiple shocks that are threatening to further reverse progress on SDGs. And let me, at this point, put into the picture the SDGs. Agenda 2030, the 17 goals, the 169 targets that are our only global agenda. 193 countries have signed, and they provide a very explicit science-based way forward from the multi-crisis to sustainability. The multi-crisis, I'm referring to pandemics and epidemics that are reoccurring more and more often, the war in Ukraine, high inflation, weak economic growth, tightening monetary and financial conditions, unsustainable debt burdens, escalating climate emergency. The impact of all these compounding shocks on developing countries is aggravated by the unfair global financial system. This system is short-term oriented and crisis-prone, and this further exacerbates inequalities, and we know what happens when inequalities increase. There is tension, there is war, there is misery. So one issue that we need to be alerted about is the need to reform the global financial architecture. I am leading the European hub of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is a global network including more than 2,000 universities across the world working on sustainability solutions. And as an economist, but with a very interdisciplinary focus, I like in this very short talk to put forward two major steps that will help all of us work towards solving the common problems. Because as it has been said already, there's no way we are going to solve our problems, the ones that I highlighted before as crises, without the collaboration between the developed world, the emerging economies, the developing economies, without the collaboration of all of us. So as UNSDSN and as the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, we lead an initiative that tries to make the point that SDGs are growth increasing. We know that they can bring growth. However, they need to be financed, and they need to be financed in the long run. The investment in SDG brings growth, but it takes time, education, health, no poverty, climate risk hedging, and so on. So we need to do two things urgently. Tackle the high cost of debt and rising risk of debt distress, including by converting short-term high-interest borrowing into long-term, more than 30-year debt at lower interest rates. And second, we need to massively scale up affordable long-term financing for development, especially through public development banks, including multilateral development banks, and by aligning all financing flows with the SDGs. The SDGs work. I work intensively with my team of more than 200 researchers in transposing them into implementable investment plans and policies across the world. They work, and we should finance their implementation, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world and the global south. And it is indeed important, like it was mentioned already, that we take into account the idiosyncratic features of each and every country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Phoebe. I now turn to Rohini Nambiar from Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Rohini, please.
Thank you for the insightful discussion and the opportunity to participate as a discussant in this event. I would like to provide the Southeast Asian perspective to this discussion. So ASEAN has often found itself in the middle of the US-China rivalry, with both countries trying to strengthen its influence in the region. The US has forged stronger military ties with some ASEAN countries and introduced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, as a way to engage the region without offering market access. China has strengthened its trade and economic ties with the region and is now the largest trading partner. Growing tensions between the US and China has resulted in increased uncertainty for the region. This relates not only to security issues such as the South China Sea and Taiwan, but also the ongoing trade war. Pressure for economic disengagement on both sides have resulted in attempts to decouple supply chains via reshoring or friendshoring key aspects, and we can see this especially in the semiconductor manufacturing. With the region deeply integrated into global supply chains, the economic cost of trade fragmentation is significant. However, ASEAN itself is not a monolithic bloc and faces a range of challenges to its unity, and the Myanmar coup is one such example which has been a thorny issue for ASEAN and has not reflected well for the bloc's unity in the past 2 years. These are some of the questions that will be raised at the upcoming ASEAN summit. And furthermore, Biden's absence at the ASEAN summit is also likely to raise questions about the US commitment to the region. Many of the panelists have talked about a third way, so I'd like to end off with a question. How can ASEAN engage further with other countries in the global south to deal with collective problems that face the world? And what are some of the particular areas for cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini Nambiar. Now I turn to Dr. Fita Simon, member of the Uganda Council of Foreign Relations in Uganda. Dr. Fita?
Thank you so much, and for this enthusiastic conversation. And I do hear very clearly and loud the aspirations here raised. And I'm speaking from the African dynamics. I think in the geopolitical rivalries, most of the categories put down here on African continent and the global south are raised between a complex of being framed from without. And so from a part of the world, we find ourselves caught in between the G5, antagonism and problems that relate to them. And so the global south construction, the third world construction remain breaking news, even now still in our ears. Because in many ways, small countries like other people have said, find themselves struggling to abide and fit whether and how to become key stakeholders on the table of discussion, to frame the agendas, to frame how ideas are shaped, to frame implementation, to frame ownership of things that pertain the ownership process of facilitating humanity's well-being across the globe. And so to the context of the rivalries, I think that Africa and the global south construction, for me, I hear it as a foreign policy communication, particularly from the first world, as I hear it. And Africa, as a response to the situation, I think has a unique way of how to rediscover themselves and assert an alternative that is akin to who they are and what they are to themselves. And so the idea that Ubuntu systems of governance where the well-being function to each other, I think becomes something very, very interesting. And I think that in these directions, the governance structures that inform how we live and express ourselves continue to function in robust ways. And many of the countries smaller countries in Africa and Latin America continue to receive access points of support from the global north, particularly the Eurocentric and American dimensions, in the ways how to support them, in the ways they amplify themselves. And so to this cause, I think that the facilitation which is growing on, for me, coming from the Ugandan system, we depend a good chunk of them on the non-aligned movement. And even so, the non-aligned movement framing continues to be a struggle because we find ourselves in a very oblique way, in some way. But this too remains a very cautious yet independent move moving forward. I will submit to say that the big chunk of belonging as ownership in the stakes of discussion on the table of the first world, it remains a very key prominent aspect that as a people in the South, we seek to invoke and ask that, no, we need to be included in the way how agendas are framed in our well-being, as opposed to being caught in the media narrative, but also in the agenda set, particularly by those who finance the global economic systems. I will submit for that and ask maybe to continue afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fita. Now I turn to Professor Tang Bei, who is from the Shanghai International Studies University in China. Professor?
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. I want to comment on 3 points very quickly. The first is that I think China has identified itself as a member of the Global South for a long time, and it has devoted significantly to unite as a group and tries to meet the people's needs. For example, by launching the Belt and Road Initiative. And we can see that there are a lot of diversity among the Global South, but I think the expansion of the BRICS group is a very good example to show that how strong their common ground is, despite all the difference, for example, between China and India, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I would like to say that maybe India's leaders nowadays, they want to exclude China from this group, but eventually they will find that China is a very essential member for this this power. And my second comment is on the global order, or the world order that the Global South wants to have. I think the answer to that question is quite clear to China, at least. The world order we want has clearly stated in the UN Charter. The problem nowadays is that the system we have today have not truly fulfilled that end, that purpose. We see that the West countries, once leading the system, once providing public goods to the world, nowadays, to a very large extent, the troublemaker for the whole society, global society. So I think that the Global South, what we want is very clear. The end is that although we have still a long way to go. My last point is I really want to say congratulations to CFCI by holding this session to talk about the role Global South has played in the 21st world order. But I suggest that next year, maybe we can have a session and not talk about how the Global South, their role in geopolitical rivalry, but by how do we go beyond global geographic rivalry to achieve a real community, a global community, by meeting people's real needs. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Tang Bei. Now I turn to Professor Oleksiy Haran, Research Director of Democratic Initiative Foundation of Ukraine. Professor Oleksiy?
Thank you very much, Terima kasih banyak. Actually, I would like to stress that if I'm from Kyiv, where we have air alarms almost every day and explosions almost every day. So I would like to send all the people who are standing in solidarity of Ukraine. And actually, I would like to stress that most of the Global South countries are supporting territorial integrity of Ukraine and withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine in UN resolution. So we are very thankful for that. Why is it so important? What are the repercussions of this war? It's not Ukraine crisis, it's Russian aggression against Ukraine. So first of all, because this is the war, former colonial empire. You know, Putin is saying that Ukrainians do not exist as a separate nation. Look, I'm in Ukrainian national shirt. So, but Putin is saying that I do not exist as Ukrainian, only if I recognize myself as Russian, as part of the Russian Empire. So the former colonial empire is trying to restore its colonial order in my country. I have a question to other participants. How would you react if the same would happen to your country? So it's not the war about territory. It's the war about our existence. Second point, Russia attacked the country which gave up nuclear weapons. Ukraine was neutral in 2014, non-bloc country, we were attacked, despite the fact that Russia provided guarantees to us. So it never happened in history of mankind before that you are giving up your nuclear weapons, you are receiving guarantees, and you are attacked. Now, this is a huge, blow to non-proliferation, to all what we are struggling for. And then we can disagree. We can even disagree on some things regarding this war. But, again, never ever in history before nuclear power station was occupied by foreign military. Can you give me example? No. But Russians did that. And this is a huge danger for the whole world if anything happened on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. So we may disagree, which is the largest in Europe. So we may disagree about the causes of the war, but there are dangerous things where we can unite and demand from Mr. Putin to leave Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. The same is about grain corridors. You know that this is a problem of starvation in the global south. But unfortunately, Russia withdrawn. Russia is burning Ukrainian grain. Russia is preventing Ukrainian grain to come to many countries of the world. So again, this is a global problem. Not to say about bombardments of civilians, deportations of children, huge human rights violations, which are every day in Ukraine. Again, this is a war which is unseen in Europe since World War II, and this war has nothing to do with NATO, because again, we were attacked as non-bloc country, the country which denuclearized voluntarily. So,
Thank you.
I think we need to stop this barbaric war, and to stop bombardments of civilians is easy. Just one word from Mr. Putin. He may order it. So please join us and demand from Mr. Putin to stop bombardments of Ukrainian civilians, to withdraw from nuclear power stations. Many of your countries are non-allied, but non-alignment doesn't mean neutrality. Actually, non-alignment was always against aggressors and against colonial powers. And we would be very, very thankful for all your support.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alexei. We have 8 minutes left, and I want to return to the 4 panelists. And I would like to encourage them to keep to the time limit of 2 minutes, so we make the 8-minute rest of the time. Dr. Samir Saran, please, your comments, your response.
No, just 2 short points. The first, I think there was great convergence and agreement amongst most speakers this morning, and it's surprising. So congratulations on being able to carve that out. My first point is that, look, I agree with previous speakers that there is a great degree of support and sympathy for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. In fact, there is also a clear understanding that this is a violation of territorial integrity, something that we all have signed on to as not condoning or supporting. However, the idea that the global south has to stand to a higher purity test when such events occur is something that is hypocritical and undermines the effort to garner their support in such a crisis. People mentioned hypocrisy, but let me ask them: when territorial integrity was being violated on the Himalayas or in South China Sea or in many other parts of the African continent, where was the enthusiastic response from Europe? My foreign minister has already mentioned that we were asked to trade more with China when China decided to redraw the boundaries on the Himalayas. So that was a European response to an Indian crisis. I don't expect India to be an active partner in a European crisis. So geography does matter. We'll have to rise above our geographies if we want peace for the world. And we must support Ukraine, and Europe must support other countries when they face similar aggression. It is not what about...
Sorry, because this is about existence of my nation.
Yeah.
Professor
Alexei, I would like for us to hear what Dr. Samir Saran has to say, please.
Look, territory matters to all of us. My territory matters to me as well. And I'm enthusiastic and emotional about my defense as well. So I said I empathize with you. Don't shout over me. We are not in conflict here. We are on the same side. So first of all, I think that would be a good European technique. Try to be on our side rather than talk to us or shout at us. So thank you for your interjection. Now, on the second point, I think what is equally important is that we have an impasse in the global system because we've not been able to update the global architecture to reflect the 21st century. Whichever way we cut the conversation, you will eventually realize that the UN and the UNSC as it exists today is a colonial enterprise. The colonies bore the brunt of the war, and the spoils of the war were shared by the colonizers and their allies. And we have to reset and reconfigure the modern day architecture that decides the flow of finance, decides the response to key emergencies, and of course provides for the needs that 7 billion people on this planet have still not been able to achieve. So we had served the 1 billion very well. The next 7 billion need to be served. And unless we redirect global governance to focus on the 7 billion people who have been left behind, geopolitics is only serving power brokers and not serving people, as one of the speakers mentioned. We need to focus on the people and move towards creating an architecture that brings them into the decision making. It cannot be a 1945 architecture that's sustained.
Okay, thank you. Since Dr. Timuriti is out, he had to go someplace now. We have two final responses. I would call Dr. Natalie Samara Singhe. Please stay with you 2 minutes because we have to keep the time for the next session. Dr. Natalie Samara Singhe.
Thank you. And this was a really rich discussion that reflects, I think, many of the dynamics we see. I want to come back to something that I think Dr. Phoebe said, really looking at why are so many of us on this panel calling for financial solutions, changes to the financial architecture, debt relief, climate finance. And it is because of this link between instability and violence. The polling that we just did in 30 countries, majorities in most of the countries, including high-income countries, were worried that political unrest will lead to violence in their streets in the next 12 months. So this is a crucial point, not for a particular region or country, it is for the whole world if we want to look at moving out of a period of intense instability. But I do also want to comment very quickly on this point on double standards, because I think we approach the question from an inherently sometimes adversarial point of view. Ukraine should have all the support it has and more. It has been invaded time and again, territories occupied, population killed, displaced, atrocities, genocidal rhetoric, a P5 nuclear state as an aggressor, huge knock-on effects. There is no question we should be supporting Ukraine. I think the question is rather, why don't we do more for other countries? And that is the crucial question. There are so many other situations where we could and should be doing more. We're not doing that. And what I see is that we're not really leveraging the huge solidarity that exists between these countries that are losing out from the global system. And there are lots in the developing world, but there are also countries in Eastern Europe and other parts that lose out, the smaller states. And I think the solution, yes, we can create new clubs, but they can't just be new clubs for the powerful. We have to, at some level, also look back at something like this universal multilateral system that we have. It doesn't work well. It is disappointing, but we can't give up on it, because who loses out? The smaller states, the vulnerable countries, and ultimately the world's population, if we don't get our act together and act on climate change. And that is unfortunately something that cannot be limited to one region. You need the solidarity to do that.
Thank you. Final word goes to Dr. Natalie Tocci. Natalie?
Well, very, 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 very briefly, I think, as has been said, there's been incredible convergence in this group in terms of where is it that we'd like to go. So let me perhaps just end with two intellectual stroke political challenges that I think we should all be facing, global north and global south. The first really is a point about power. We've been talking a lot about multipolarity, and yet I ask myself, is this really where we're heading? In the sense that on the one hand, we see G7, G7 plus. On the other hand, which is obviously being, in a sense, led by the United States. On the other hand, we see BRICS and BRICS plus, right? Which is very clearly being led by China. I think this is becoming increasingly explicit. We see the real multilateral organization that should be representing multipolarity, the G20, actually in quite a bit of trouble, yeah? And India knows this well, as it sort of seeks, and Indonesia did last year, as it seeks to bring everyone around the table. So where exactly is the international system heading, I think, is still an open question. Second point really regards laws. And, on the one hand, we've been talking a lot about, the double standards, the hypocrisy, the way in which this has all been revealed. Is the West doing enough about other conflicts around the world? And yet, I think there's also a question that the Global South should be posing itself. What is the price
Recording in progress.
to pay for territorial integrity and sovereignty in the case of Ukraine beyond declarations? I think
Recording stopped.
we should be posing ourselves. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Dino.
Well, thank you, everybody. I wish this is a conversation that can be extended, such rich topics and really exciting discussions. I want to thank all the panelists for taking part in this session. And I will now turn the discussion to Cindy, who will introduce the next session. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Natalie, Tochi. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Amita, Phoebe, Rohini, Fita, Tangpe, and Alexei. Thank you so much. Yeah.